Und ich begrüße dazu jetzt einen der prominentesten Politikwissenschaftler der Welt, Francis Fukuyama von der Stanford University, der 1989 mit seinem Essay Das Ende der Geschichte weltberühmt geworden ist. Der Autor zahlreicher weiterer Bücher ist heute auf Einladung des Wiener Instituts für die Wissenschaft von Menschen IWM und der Erste Stiftung in Wien und jetzt hier im ZIP-2-Studio. Good evening. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Fukuyama, do you believe Donald Trump and his negotiators will succeed in bringing the fighting in Ukraine somehow to an end, similar maybe to what had happened in Gaza a couple of weeks ago?
I hope not, because I think a ceasefire at this point would mean conceding to all of these Russian demands for Ukrainian territory, for limitations on the size of the Ukrainian army. It's not going to bring an end to the war. It may bring a temporary ceasefire, but Putin is simply going to start the war again when he thinks that he can get everything he wants, through force.
When Vladimir Putin said today that Europe wants to block an agreement and if Europe wants war, Russia is ready for it, what does that mean?
Putin has been threatening escalation from the beginning of his full-scale invasion. I think that's one of the reasons the Biden administration was very cautious in providing adequate weapons to Ukraine. I think this is a bluff. Putin doesn't want a war with Europe any more than, he wants to lose his own position in Russia. So I think that he's very good at bluffing and threatening, but I don't think it's something that should affect, the ultimate decision-making by European leaders.
Do you think the Biden administration was too cautious?
Yes, I think that Ukraine had a lot of momentum by the end of the first year of the war, so that would have made it in 2023. If they had provided long-range weapons of adequate numbers, I think they really could have forced the Russians at that point to go for a real ceasefire.
And why didn't they do it?
Well, I think that Biden, had this fear of escalation. He believed Putin's threats that, there were red lines, that if they were crossed, he would escalate to nuclear weapons. I don't think that was ever in the cards, but, I'm afraid that Biden, was afraid of that.
What is Donald Trump actually trying to achieve now with these negotiations?
It's hard to know. I think that he has bought the Russian line about Ukraine really not being a real country, not being a sovereign entity that he needs to respect, that it's really part of a greater Russia. And Trump seems to believe that, and he also seems to believe that Ukraine's military position is hopeless, so all they can do is basically accede to Russian demands.
The Wall Street Journal thinks it's all about money and ran a long story a couple of days ago on the negotiations headline, Make Business, Not War. Is that the case, that it's not about peace, but about business?
Unfortunately, much of Trump's foreign policy is really it's not even about business, it's about his personal standing and his personal wealth. And I think that he thinks that, for example, he might be able to get hold of some of the money being held in Europe, the Russian money that has been sequestered ever since the beginning of the war. So yeah, I don't put it past him to be motivated by that kind of factor.
And what does Vladimir Putin want? Is it about Crimea and eastern Ukraine? Is it about the whole of Ukraine? Is it about something else?
He has said very explicitly what his war aims are. As I said, he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a legitimate sovereign country. He thinks that it's the seat of Russian civilization and that it properly should be part of a greater Russia. So his war aims are really to, I think, ultimately absorb the whole of Ukraine.
Do you think that he will attack another European country in the coming years?
I think that he is good at bluffing. I don't think he will attack another European country before he's completely subdued Ukraine. But I do think, the Baltics and Poland are ultimately going to be at risk if he's not stopped at an earlier point.
If an agreement in Ukraine were to be reached, what exactly would Putin have achieved after 4 years of war? NATO is larger by 2 members. Russia's NATO border is far longer than it was before. The EU is rearming in an unprecedented level. Ukraine is better armed than ever and may become a member of EU. Russia's economy is weakened and totally dependent on China now. And Putin ends up with Crimea and eastern Ukraine, which he already had controlled before the invasion. And for that, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have died.
Yeah.
How will he ever be able to sell that as a victory at home?
Well, in fact, I think closer to 1 million Russians have been killed or wounded in this conflict. I think it's completely crazy. I think Putin thought that he could grab the Donbass and retain hold of Crimea in a few days. And it turned out the Ukrainians were much tougher than he ever expected. And so I think if he had it to do all over again, he may not have made that choice. But now that he's in, he wants to basically show that he can achieve his full aims. And that's why I don't think a ceasefire is in the cards, because it's only going to be a momentary interruption in a long-term Russian project to absorb the whole of Ukraine.
And can he conquer Ukraine?
I don't think so. Well, I should say it really depends on Ukraine's external friends, because I think that they need the weapons and they need the financial support in order to keep going. But given an adequate level of both, I think I don't think that they're going to be conquered.
There's no way of doing an interview with you without talking about your famous essay from 1989, when you ask whether the end of history had arrived with the collapse of communism and the end of the Soviet Union. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has history returned in 2022?
Well, we're obviously in a very different period than when I wrote that book back in the late 80s, early 90s. Democracy is in retreat in many places. You have growing authoritarian powers. So the period is still, going backwards with a lot of democratic backsliding. However, the book was really not about short-term issues. It's a question of what does a modern society consist of? And my argument was that for 150 years, intellectuals thought it meant a Marxist end of history, meaning a communist utopia, and that was something that was simply not going to happen. And I think it remains the case that liberal democracy tied to a market economy is the best way of organizing a society, and I don't think a better one has been discovered.
Your basic argument was that liberal democracy is actually the best way going forward because there is no attractive alternative left. But today we see more and more illiberal democracies, including in the United States itself.
Yeah.
Would you ever have thought that this would be possible?
Quite honestly, I didn't. I didn't think that the United States would succumb to a demagogue like Donald Trump. He clearly has authoritarian instincts. He would like to be a king that can simply order people to do, his will. And, unfortunately, even though he tried to overturn the 2020 election through illegal means, he managed to get reelected. And I didn't think that Americans would vote for a politician that had attacked basic democratic principles in the way that Donald Trump had.
And that wasn't the only thing. He was convicted for fraud on 34 times.
That's right.
But he has assaulted at least one woman. He has actually said before the election that he would love to be a dictator even for one day. Why did 77 million people, voters in the United States, vote for him?
Well, I think it turns out that defending democracy and democratic institutions, the rule of law, these are all very abstract things to most Americans. What they care about are prices at the grocery store, how much it costs to buy a gallon of gas, these sorts of things. And to them, that was the most immediate problem that they were facing, not the erosion of democracy, democratic institutions. So I think voters really have a kind of short-term understanding of what their own, interests are.
But the US Constitution, with its famous checks and balances, was particularly designed to prevent an autocrat from taking power. Why are these checks and balances apparently failing right now?
Well, I don't think they're failing. I actually think that Trump has reached the peak of his power. And just in the last month, you see important cracks in his facade. Everyone was afraid of him in the Republican Party up until the last couple of weeks. Because of this Jeffrey Epstein scandal, a lot of his most fervent supporters have now turned against him because they now see that he's part of a cover-up of this big pedophile scandal. A lot of them wanted, to stay out of foreign wars, and he's been perfectly happy to jump into Gaza, to Iran. He's about to attack Venezuela, and they didn't vote for that. And so I think that he is weakening in certain very key ways. People are less afraid of him, and so we may have actually reached peak Trump and now are on the downside of some real accountability.
But do you think there is actually a revolt within the Republican Party against Trump feasible?
It's happening. You've seen Republican politicians just in the last week stand up and criticize him. You've seen companies now suing the government for the tariffs. The Supreme Court may overturn the entire tariff policy of Donald Trump as unconstitutional. And so, he's facing a lot of setbacks to his agenda.
Do you think an impeachment, a successful impeachment, is thinkable within the next 3 years?
I don't think another impeachment will happen. What's more likely to happen is in the midterm elections next November, the Democrats will do extremely well the way they did in the recent elections we had about 3 weeks ago, and they'll win by big margins, and that will be the ultimate check on Trump's power.
Trump and his supporters still keep talking about Trump 2028, a third term that is forbidden by the Constitution. Do you nevertheless consider it possible that Trump might actually refuse to leave the White House?
Well, he tried to do that once already, so I can't say it'll never happen. But I think that the third term, the idea of a third term is so outlandish that he's not going to get a lot of support. And if people are now seeing that he's a lame duck president, he only has 3 years left, they're not going to be afraid of him the way that they were previously. So I think the likelihood of him trying to hold on for another 4 years after 2028 is almost zero probability.
The historian Timothy Snyder said on this very program that he does not know a single criteria of fascism that Donald Trump does not meet. Is Donald Trump a fascist?
Well, again, it depends on your definition of fascism. I would just say that he is a very clear authoritarian who does not like democracy, has no respect for democratic principles, does not understand the rule of law except as a weapon that he can use against other people. So that's bad enough. Whether he's a fascist or not, I think is still debatable.
But to sum it up, will American democracy survive Donald Trump?
Yes, I definitely believe it will survive Donald Trump.
Professor Fukuyama, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much.